Hey everyone, this is Coloring Chemist. My name is Connie and welcome back to my channel. Do you like my molecule? It's very nice, isn't it? We'll get into what this is in a little bit. I just wanted to have something there so you weren't staring at a blank piece of paper. But this is going to be a video that, oh my goodness, I hope it isn't too long and too complicated. I apologize if it is, but this is going to be a video where we talk about some of the chemistry behind pigments versus dyes. And I apologize, this video's kind of been a long time in coming. And partly it's because this time of year, I'm filming this kind of mid-December, is midterm time for me as a teacher. Some of you may know I'm a chemistry teacher, so I haven't had a lot of free time. And also because as I was researching and trying to put this video together, there's so much chemistry that I could get into. And I kept, having these rabbit trails that I would follow and then thinking to myself, oh, Connie, you have to rein this back. Nobody but you is going to care about the stuff that you're researching. So it was hard. It was hard for me to know where to draw that line so that I don't go too far, but I also go far enough into the chemistry. So I guess I apologize ahead of time both ways. Some of you may feel that I went too far. Some of you may feel that I didn't go far enough. We can just sort of hope for a Goldilocks situation, I guess, where hopefully I get it just right. So I'll do my best. So I'm going to move my molecule out of the way here, and let's get started. Before I go further on the pigment journey that we started, we talked about prehistoric pigments, right? I had done a previous video and we talked about the pigments that were used in prehistoric times. And I do want to continue that journey. But before I do, I need to talk a little bit about what is a pigment and what is a dye. Because it's going to come up and it's going to be important to differentiate and distinguish between the two. So before I do that, actually, I want to, a few little kind of chemistry terminology kind of definitions here first. So I know, hopefully this doesn't bother anyone, but when I write, I have to write this way. I don't know, it's just how I write. We need to talk about, and this is going to seem silly, what it means to dissolve. So when we are talking in chemistry about something dissolving in something else, it means that molecule of a substance gets surrounded by solvent molecules. And in lots of cases, that solvent could be water, or it could be what we think of as, an actual solvent. It could be something like turpentine or, those sorts of things. But when we talk about, say, a dye dissolves in its binder, in its solvent. So that means that all the little molecules of the dye, that's going to be the substance, each one of those little molecules is going to end up surrounded by water molecules. And that's why dyes are see-through, right? And I have an example here of, this is Tim Holst's, this is a distress spray stain. This happens to be called T-dye. So this is a spray dye for paper's pore surface. So I think probably a lot of you have seen, distress sprays. If I look at sort of the bottom of the bottle, you can see as I turn it, hopefully, there's you can actually see through. This is a dark dye, so maybe this was a bad example, but I don't have a whole lot of these. But there's no sediment, right? There's no solid in the bottom. So whatever colorant is in here, the dye that's in here, it's dissolved in the solvent. In this case, it's water with maybe a few other things. And a dye will stay dissolved in the solvent. Now, I also have example of one of the Tim Holtz Distress Oxide sprays. Now this is a different beast, isn't it? Because look at the bottom when I turn this upside down. Can you see what's all stuck on the bottom? I'm going to shake this. It might be a little loud. The Distress Oxide sprays have a little mixing ball in them. And the reason for that is because there is not only a dye in here, but there is a pigment. So pigments do not dissolve in their solvent. So let's see if we can break some of this down and kind of write some of this down. So let's see here. We have, let's put pigments here. And we'll put dyes here. So a pigment is usually a powder. Usually. It doesn't have to be, but it usually is. A dye is usually in liquid form. But the part of the dye that causes color doesn't actually, it might not necessarily be a liquid itself. It might be a powder or something like that. But dyes are soluble. And that's a fancy chemistry word, meaning the colorant that's in a dye dissolves in its solvent. So whatever the colorant molecule is in dyes, they're going to dissolve. They're soluble in their solvent. Pigments are insoluble. Now, that's funny. Usually in the English language, if you want to say the opposite of something, often you put "un" in front of it, right? So, you know, if I talk about something being heated or unheated, right? Heated, unheated, they mean opposites. Oftentimes in science, though, instead of "un," we'll use "in" to mean the opposite. So insoluble means not soluble. And dyes are soluble. So pigments are usually powder, and they're insoluble in oftentimes water, solvents, all kinds of things. So pigments will stay as a powder even when they're in their paint, right? Even when they're in mixed in with all the other things that would make a paint or a crayon or anything like that, they're not going to dissolve. A dye is soluble, and it quite often is in liquid form, so it's dissolved up, right? A paint needs to be fixed to there's a word we use in art called a ground. Needs to be fixed to the ground or the support. And that's just a fancy way of saying a pigment needs to be fixed to your paper, your canvas, your rock wall. If you're rock painting, that's the ground or the support. That's the ground or the support is what you're doing your art on. Piece of paper, a canvas, right? So a pigment needs to be fixed. And of course we talked about this when we did the video about colored pencils. You've got binders and those sorts of things in colored pencils that allow the pigment that's in those colored pencils to stick to the paper. Otherwise, if I just had pigment powder and rubbed it on the paper, it would just brush off, right? Oil paints will have, something like linseed oil. Watercolor paints will have maybe something like oxgall or honey, right? So all of these different kinds of, they call them paint systems, even though it's a colored pencil, it's still called a paint system, like in the core. They have to include some sort of binder to help fix the pigment. But dyes don't necessarily, well, they do need a binder as well. That it'll help it to stick to whatever it is you're putting the dye on. Pigment paints or pigment, any kind of paint system where you would have pigments tend to be opaque. And opaque is a fancy word that means you can't see through it, right? Take this oxide spray, this Distress Oxide spray. This has a dye in there as well, which is probably what is maybe giving it the color, but it does have a pigment. If I try and look through, right, I know it's got a label on it, but if I try and look through the liquid that's in here to see underneath, I can't, right? This is opaque. I can't see through this. Whereas, well, this was, and the bottle also is, oh no, the bottle is clear, I guess. This is a really dark one, but I didn't have a lighter one. But if I had a lighter one, I could probably see the page through this distress spray stain, right? This is a dye. It's not opaque. It's transparent. Transparent means I can see through it. Translucent means that light shines through it, right? So pigment paints tend to be opaque. Dyes tend to be transparent. Right? Now, I will put a little note here. Note. You can grind pigments very finely. In other words, if a pigment is a powder, they usually grind it up, right? In the old days, it'd be like a mortar and pestle. You might have seen that in movies. But, I mean, nowadays, obviously, it's done in big, industrial scale. But a pigment is ground up to a powder. If you keep grinding it, so you're making the little teeny pigment particles smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, so you can grind pigment particles very finely, so that some light gets through. And what that does is it produces watercolor paints. If you think about the difference between, say, an acrylic paint or a watercolor paint, an acrylic paint, has something to do with the binders in there as well. But an acrylic paint is opaque, right? If I have a little bottle of craft acrylic paint, I hold it up to the light, I can't see through that acrylic paint. But if I have some liquid watercolor in a bottle, it's going to be kind of like that Distress spray stain, right? I can see through the liquid watercolor paint. Now, maybe some liquid watercolor paints are made of dyes, I don't know. But if they do use pigments, it's because they will have ground those pigments finely enough. The little pigment particles are fine enough that instead of settling out to the bottom, like they did in that Distress Oxide spray, they will stay suspended in the liquid, and then you get these watercolor paints. In antiquity, artists used oil paints a lot, but if they wanted glazes for their paintings, a glaze was a layer that they would put over top that actually allowed you to see what was still underneath, right? If they wanted to alter the color, say, of someone's gown or someone's dress in a painting, they would, you can, mix your colors separately and then paint them on, but once you've got that color down, if you go over it with another oil paint, that's mostly going to cover up the color that you have. So if you had a yellow dress, say, but you wanted it a slightly different shade of yellow, they could make what were called glazes. And you would get a glaze by just grinding the pigment that much finer and using different binders and what have you. But then you could get these glazes as well. Okay. What else can we talk about here? So pigments sit on the surface of whatever you're working on. So if I'm coloring with a colored pencil on a piece of paper, the color sits on the surface of the paper. Dyes are, and you're going to think I'm making a spelling mistake here, but I'm not, adsorbed by the support. I did not mean absorbed. I really did mean adsorbed. There's a difference between the two. I won't get into it, but that's technically the right chemical term. So, I mean, think about dyeing something. If you're dyeing a piece of cloth, you don't want the color to sit on the surface of the cloth because it'll either wear off or get washed off, right? So when you're dyeing a piece of cloth, you want that color to go into the cloth. But when you're using pigments and paints, you want that paint, that pigment, that color to sit on the surface of your support. So there's another difference between pigments and dyes. Some examples of things that have pigments in them that we would, run across in our coloring and in our art. Paints. Now, we could be talking about acrylic paints, watercolor paints, oil paints. All of those would contain, pigments as colorants, not dyes. Colored pencils will have pigments in them, not dyes. Crayons. Pastels. So whether that be, and I don't mean pastel colors, well, I mean, could be if we're talking about pastel, colored pencils. But, I've got some things off to the side here. So pigments, we'd have, colored pencils. I've got some paints here. I've got, what else have I got? Here's some crayons. These are the Posca crayons, but they're artist colored crayons, but they're still crayons. What else have we got here? Pastels. These are some oil pastels. These are the iridescent ones by Sennelier, but chalk pastels, oil pastels, those would all contain pigments. That Distress Oxide spray. This was interesting. This is a VersaFine Clair ink pad, but it says pigment ink. That's interesting because ink is normally a dye. So, and you know what? We can actually say the same thing about Pitt pens. Normally pens or markers, and we'll write that down over here as well, but pens or markers would be ink. But Pitt pens are pigment inks. So sometimes you can have crossovers. So pastels, we could say pigment inks. Those are all things that would contain pigments. What's going to contain dyes? Well, let's get some of these out of the way here. So those are all things that would have pigments, they're paints. What are going to contain dyes? Inks. Most inks, except the ones that say pigment ink. So, distress inks, right? This distress spray stain, these are dyes. Alcohol markers. So that's another one. We can say inks, markers. So alcohol markers are going to contain dyes. Watercolor markers. Here I've got, what have I got here? I've got an Albrecht Dürer watercolor marker. And then I have a Goldfaber Aqua Dual marker. I have a Zig Art and Graphic Twin water-based dye ink marker. Even the pens that you use in everyday life, these are going to be dye-based, right? They're going to have dyes in them. So inks, markers, dyes themselves, like if you go and buy some dye that, you're going to dye a piece of fabric or something like that, that's going to have dye in it, obviously. And think about, we talk about, I've heard people say before that dyes are liquid. Not necessarily, right? Remember before I said they're just in liquid form. If you buy a box of dye at the store, it's quite often in powdered form and you have to dissolve it, but it's used in liquid form. And then you have the ink tents. Now, ink tents are an odd little beast, aren't they? They're a colored pencil. They are water soluble, but they have ink in them, which of course there's a dye component. Now, I don't know what exactly are in Inktense pencils. I wish I did because they're fascinating. I'm wondering if maybe there's some pigment and some dye in each pencil. I don't know. The ink is going to give an intensity of color once it's dissolved. So these really are more intense, once you color them out and dissolve them, than say a watercolor pencil would be. A watercolor pencil is still going to have just pigment in it. It's not going to have any dye. So when you dissolve or activate a watercolor pencil, you're just basically letting all those tiny little pigment particles kind of spread out onto the paper with the water. Whereas Inktense has a dye in it. So when you activate it, I don't know if there's pigment in here as well, maybe. But when you activate it, you're actually having a dye kind of go into the paper, and that's why you can't lift Inktense either, right? Pigments you can lift because, of course, well, mostly. Some of them have some dyeing ability, but mostly they sit on the surface of your support, right? So you can lift pigments afterwards. You can't lift dyes. I mean, think about dyeing a piece of cloth. How do you get that dye back out? You try and wash it out. Maybe some of it will come out. But Inktense, because they have dye in them, you can't lift them. After they're there. You're basically dyeing that section of the paper. Now, I think there might be pigment in here as well. I don't know. I'd love to know. All right. Now, I have some things to show you here. So here we've got sort of a basic background of sort of pigments versus dyes. This is a color chart of just a few selected sort of technically important inorganic colored and black pigments. So what do you see here? You see some iron oxide. Those are our ochres, chrome oxide green. So you see some greens, some kind of earthy browns, yellows, oranges, some blues. What are you not seeing? Pinks, purples, right? That's because, as well as talking about pigments sort of versus dyes, we need to talk about how can I divide this up here? We need to talk about pigments and whether they are inorganic. I'll talk about what that means in a sec. Or organic. And we need to talk about dyes. And dyes are always organic. So there is no inorganic dyes. What do I mean by inorganic and organic? Well, it's not maybe what you think it means. In this day and age, when people talk about things that are organic, they mean like, organic produce, but that's not what I mean. I mean in the chemistry sense. Inorganic is, how can we say this? Not from living things. That's what we mean by inorganic, roughly. Inorganic means, although not always nowadays, but originally organic meant from living things. So we can get pigments from inorganic sources or from organic sources. we can get dyes only from organic sources. And on top of that, we can have inorganic pigments that are natural and inorganic pigments that are synthetic. Oops, I can't spell. Synthetic. Oops. And we can have organic pigments that are natural or synthetic. And by natural, I mean, well, what you think it means, right? Naturally occurring. Synthetic means made in a lab, basically, or made by humans. Dyes can also be natural or synthetic. And don't worry, I'm getting to the pink and the purple part. When we were talking in our first video about the prehistoric pigments, we were talking about this over here, right? They were inorganic pigments, not from living things, and they were natural, right? They were things like our ochres, right? Those are going to be natural inorganic pigments. Things like lamp black, charcoal, right? We talked about all those things. Some of the ones we haven't talked about yet, but we will. A pigment called malachite. That's inorganic. So basically from rocks. I mean, that's not from living things. If you think about what's on the earth that's not living, rocks, dirt, right? Those are, you know. So malachite will come from minerals, rocks. Ultramarine. Now, this is old school ultramarine that's actually from a mineral called lapis lazuli. Cinnabar is another one. Those are all natural inorganic pigments. And if you look back at that color chart I had, there's your ochres, your iron oxides. Your cinnabar is going to kind of be in here. It's vermilion, so it's a little redder. Iron oxide black, but you know, our charcoal blacks, they're not iron oxide, but that's going to be in there as well. We also have natural organic pigments. Now, there's only one that I can actually think of. That's indigo. So until, well, in prehistory, you know, these are the kinds of colors, and even into the ancients kind of era, these are the kind of colors that you would have seen. Now, ancients and prehistoric people also had dyes, but they didn't use dyes to paint because dyes, they're soluble. And I think I talked about this before when we were talking about the prehistoric pigments. I'm sure prehistoric people knew that if you took a piece of, you know, cloth or whatever, well, they would have had hides, and you'd say boiled it in a solution with a lot of really dark leafy greens, you could probably dye, you know, whatever it was, a beautiful kind of leaf green color. But how do you use that as a paint, right? If I dip a brush or something into that beautiful green liquid and try and apply it to, you know, the wall of a cave, it's not going to make the wall of the cave look green. Because remember, dyes are supposed to soak into whatever you're putting them on. They don't sit on the surface. Pigments sit on the surface. So in those ancient times, your colors were limited. Even though they could make a lot of colors, the colors were limited in terms of what they could use as pigments. So they had beautiful natural dyes. For example, sap green, right, is made from boiling a particular kind of berry. Rose madder is a lovely pinky purple dye. Carmine is another lovely dye. What's another one? Woad is another lovely dye. That's a lovely, talk about the Druids, and they had, they would paint themselves in blue, but those are all dyes. So to get the pinks and the purples, what they had to do was, and this was known about, thousands of years ago, they would have to take the dyes, so carmine, rose madder, those are lovely pinky purple colors, but they're dyes, right? You would boil up, madder comes from the root of the madder plant. You would boil up the root and you would do some other things. You would get this lovely pinky purple color, but you couldn't use it as a paint. In order to use dyes as paints, you can do something to them called laking. And this is where in the title card for this video, I talked about, why pigments that are called lake pigments. So we have something like rose madder lake, carmine lake. It doesn't have anything to do with the color of water or a body of water. Laking, the word lake, comes from the same historical word as lacquer, shellac. So it comes from this word lac. And probably because it would, by taking these dyes and laking them, you could make them so that they could be applied on the surface, which is what shellac would be as well. I'm guessing there. And so laking of dyes turns dyes into pigments. So you could take the color of the dye and turn it into something that would stay on the surface. So then you could paint with it. So you can turn dyes into pigments. You can't turn pigments into dyes, though. So it only goes one way. You could do this by sometimes, and this is a very simple way of laking a dye. You could mix the dye with chalk or clay, like powdered chalk or clay, and then let that dry, and then you would have like a powdered chalk or a clay that would have some of the same color as the dye did. But it wasn't the greatest way to do it. It would work. But a better way to do it is to mix the dye with something called a mordant. Mordant. And if you mix dyes with mordants, and mordants are usually metal salts. When we say salt in chemistry, we don't always mean table salt. It can be a word we could talk about other chemicals when we use the word salt. So I'm not talking about table salt here, just so you know that. But yeah, a mordant, which is some, it's a compound that's going to have some metal in it, certain kinds of metal. What are some common metals used for a mordant? Chromium is one. Trying to think. Cadmium, I think, is another one. So if you mix a dye with this mordant, and then there's some other things you have to do, but you mix the dye with a mordant and you turn the dye into a pigment. So we can actually, we see this in some of the names of the colors that we see, right? Madder Lake, Rose Madder Lake, alizarin crimson lake, carmine lake. Not all lake pigments have the word lake in them. Sometimes they just drop them. So sometimes when they say rose madder, I mean, if it's rose madder and it's in your colored pencil, it's a lake. Because otherwise, if it was still a dye, it wouldn't be in your colored pencil, right? So if you have a colored pencil that says rose madder it contains rose madder lake pigment. All right. What else can I show you here? So we've got, did we cover everything? I've got a bunch of notes off to the side here, and I've skipped so much of it because I'm just, as I'm looking at the notes, I'm thinking, oh, Connie, they don't want to know that. They really don't want to know that. But laking then is where we're going to get our pinks and our purples. Because you can get beautiful, pinks and purple dyes, but if we want them as pigments, we're going to have to lake them. And so we could have, things like up here, where can I put that? Well, I mean, I guess they would kind of belong under, too far there. They would kind of belong under synthetic organic pigments. So we could say lake pigments. So there's kind of a crossover from down here to up here, right? You would take things like the madder dye, the carmine dye, and you would lake them and turn them into pigments. So what are some examples? So we looked at examples of, and I put those under synthetic, even though, the original dye came from natural sources. But in order to get them to be a pigment, humans had to do something to them, right? That's what we mean by synthetic. So we looked at some example of natural inorganic pigments. So natural pigments from that were not originally from living things, so from minerals and those sorts of things. What are some synthetic organic pigments? The cadmium pigments. Sorry, I said cadmium was a laking or a mordant. It's not. Chrome is a good mordant. Aluminum, calcium, maybe that's what I was thinking of. So cadmium pigments. So if we see, cadmium yellow, cadmium, usually it's cadmium orange, those sorts of things, those are going to be inorganic pigments. So they're not originally from living things, but they're made by humans. You wouldn't dig up chromium or cadmium yellow or cadmium orange. You just wouldn't. The very first synthetic inorganic pigment was something called Egyptian blue. And it's this beautiful blue color. And after the fall of the Roman Empire, we actually lost the recipe for how to make this. And so it wasn't until, my goodness, it might even have been the 18 or 1900s that chemists finally figured out how Egyptian blue, the color that they would see when they were doing all these excavations in Egypt and seeing this beautiful blue color painted on the walls of tombs, they had no idea how they made it. It wasn't until, 2,000 years later that we finally figured it out. So Egyptian blue is pretty much the first synthetic inorganic pigment, right? It was made by humans, and it didn't come from natural sources. It actually had to use, there's a copper kind of compound that gets used there, so that's one. Verdigris, I think we've talked about that before. That's another one. Oh, that should have been an I. Verdigris. Emerald green. We see that. That's a synthetic inorganic pigment. Vermilion, which is a red color. Now, synthetic vermilion is very similar to cinnabar, so there's a bit of a crossover there. But what are some other synthetic organic pigments? Well, here's where we get into modern chemistry. So things like quinacridones, right? We see that's hard to say, quinacridone pink, quinacridone purple, quinacridone violet. That's modern chemistry. Lake pigments, humans have been making lake pigments for thousands of years. But modern chemistry, and this is where the definition of organic from living things falls apart a bit. We call this, it's still called organic chemistry, but quinacridones are not made from living things. They're completely and totally made in a lab, but they're still based on somewhat similar chemical principles. Let's just put it that way. The phthalocyanines. Right? So we see those phthalocyanine colors, phthalocyanine blue, phthalocyanine green. Those are synthetic organic pigments. The indanthrines, or indanthrones, they're kind of the same thing. Indanthrene blue, indanthrone blue, those are going to fall here. Any of your pigments that have azo in the title. So, trying to think, azo blue, azo green, those are going to be organic synthetic pigments. And then down here, these organic synthetic dyes are going to kind of be the same as basically these here, because these are modern. And in modern chemistry, chemists have gotten so good at playing with the structures of molecules that they can make, some of these. Before modern chemistry, there was a pretty big difference between pigments and dyes. Pigments sat on the surface, dyes did not. And it was difficult to make the crossover between them, except for this concept of laking. But now, chemists can make quinacridone. So I'm going to put this like that. Because chemists can make quinacridone pigments, they can also make quinacridone dyes. They can make phthalocyanine pigments and phthalocyanine dyes. Indanthrene pigments, indanthrene dyes. So we've gotten a lot better at, crossing over. Now, back to, where's my model here? A lot of these new dyes and things that they're making and pigments are based on this molecule. This is called anthraquinone. And you might see that name in some pigment names as well, right? Anthraquinone. I built it just because it was fun. These are, and you might have seen these in high school, these are molecular model kits. And they're little plastic spheres. I might even have pulled these out before, I don't know. The different colors represent different elements. The reds represent oxygen, the blacks represent carbon, and the little white ones represent hydrogen. And this anthraquinone is the basis for so many of our modern colors. So many of our, it's also the basis for a lot of our natural colors. Alizarin crimson is an anthraquinone dye. Rose madder is an anthraquinone dye. So, I don't know. I just thought I would build it. Well, because it was fun. And, you can see some of the sticks here that join them. Sometimes there's two. You see that? And sometimes there's only one. That's double bonds and single bonds for those of you that are familiar or remember some of your high school chemistry. But, yeah, there's an anthraquinone molecule. And, of course, chemists have these because you can't see molecules, right? You just can't. They're so small. It's not like biology where you can take a microscope and look at a cell. There are trillions and trillions of molecules in a cell. So not even with electron microscopes can you see molecules. So because you can't ever see basically anything we talk about in chemistry, you can see a reaction in a lab, but you can't see what's going on with the molecules. We've come up with a lot of very inventive ways to help us visualize, what we're talking about. And that's what I've basically done here. So this is a visualization of anthraquinone. So there's a picture of it. So you can sort of see what I built there. Kind of the same. So there you go. So I hope that wasn't too rambling. I'll put this back here just for you to look at. And I guess what I really wanted folks to get from this is this idea of the difference between pigments and dyes, the idea of laking dyes to make lake pigments, because that's going to become important as we go forward in our pigment journey, and just understanding, why going back into prehistoric times and antiquity, we don't see bright pink cave paintings. We don't see really beautiful bright green colors on, you know, on, well, even beautiful bright green colors going back, they were hard to get because, again, the beautiful bright green colors in antiquity and even back into medieval times and those sorts of things, you could get beautiful bright green dyes, but how do you paint with that? Some dyes can be laked, not all of them. Some of them it just doesn't work. So it wasn't until modern chemistry came about and we started to be able to create these modern synthetic pigments that we could get this, amazing color range that we have today. So that's basically what I wanted you guys to get out of this. So once again, I hope it wasn't too much. I hope it wasn't too little. If there's anything that anyone is confused about, please don't hesitate to let me know in the comments. I'll try and straighten it out as best as I can. If you're liking what you're seeing in my videos, please consider hitting that like button or maybe subscribing to my channel, hitting the notification bell, maybe letting friends know that you found this new channel. Well, not so new anymore, I guess. I'm almost coming up in 3 months. That you found this coloring channel, this art channel that talks about art and coloring maybe in a little bit of a different way. I hope everyone is safe. I hope everyone is well. And I hope everybody's enjoying their coloring. Until next time, bye-bye.